She wasn't supposed to have a choice. In 1880s Texas, 19-year-old Emily Carter stood in a tattered wedding dress, forced by her own stepmother to marry a man twice her age. The town watched in silence, expecting her to surrender, until a single sound shattered everything. A knife driven into the altar, and words that no one dared speak out loud. "I will not be bartered like cattle." What followed was not just a wedding, but a battle for freedom, a sister's desperate cry for help, and a moment when an entire town had to decide, are women property, or are they children of God, born to choose their own destiny? Before you judge the ending, you need to hear how one girl's defiance, one man's patience, and even the loyalty of a dog would turn a life of chains into a story of love and redemption that no one expected. The noon heat in Dry Creek, Texas, pressed down like an iron lid, turning the main street into a ribbon of glare where horses stamped at horseflies and porch shadows clung to the buildings as if afraid to move. Grit rasped along the clapboards of the chapel, and the wind smelled of alkali dust, old leather, and sun-baked hay. Inside, the little white church worked hard to look clean. Quilts hung over the back pews. A jar of wildflowers fought the heat on the windowsill, and a threadbare runner led to a pine table that served as an altar. But the summer had a way of making everything honest, and no one in town could pretend this was anything but what it was. A transaction wrapped in scripture. Emily Carter stood at the threshold, 19 years old, the edges of her girlhood ground away by a year of grief and hunger after her father was put in the ground last spring. She was long-limbed and strong from chores, with a sun-browned complexion that refused to be genteel, gray-blue eyes that rarely looked down, and a spill of chestnut hair that her stepmother had pinned too tightly beneath a borrowed veil. The dress had belonged to Emily's mother, lace gone yellow, seams let out by an unkind hand, hem scuffed from a hurried restitching, and though the fabric tried to whisper of softer years, the girl inside it was all iron, jaw set, shoulders squared, fingers worrying a frayed ribbon hidden in her palm, the last thing of her father's she kept. Margaret Reed Carter, the stepmother who had arrived in their lives with neat ledgers and a smaller heart, stood just behind Emily, the heat bringing out a sour sheen on her powdered face. She was a slender woman of 38 with a pinched mouth and calculating hazel eyes. Her straw-blonde hair lacquered into respectability, the kind of figure that looked delicate until you noticed the tendons at the neck, the knuckles that always tightened around money. In town, she spoke in bright, brittle compliments, but at home her voice was a ruler striking a desk. She had a way of turning necessity into moral law and debt into destiny, and this wedding was the sum she had solved for. Pastor Amos Whitlow, a compact, balding man who wore his worry in the creases beside his nose, cleared his throat for the third time and twitched his collar as if mercy might be hiding underneath. He had served funerals during the fever winter and had learned then that scripture could sound like a lullaby or a hammer depending on who held it, and today his Bible felt heavy. At the far end of the aisle stood William Hayes, 42, plains broad in the shoulders, taller than most men by a head, and carved by weather the way the mesas are carved by wind. His hair, once black, now carried the first threads of iron gray at the temples, his beard trimmed close along a hard jaw that had been broken once and set a little imperfectly, leaving his smile, when it came, tilted and reluctant. His eyes were the brown of creek water at dusk, steady, watchful, and too quiet, and his coat, black and well-brushed, sat on him with the same unshowy purpose as his work gloves. He owned more cattle than anyone for 50 miles and more fences than any one man could ride in a week. Yet he wore no gun today and kept his wide-brimmed hat respectfully in his hand. Town whispered a lot about William, that he hardly came to socials, that he played a guitar alone on his porch when the wind was up, that some old hurt had taught him to stand apart. No one could name the hurt, but they could point to the way he left space around him like a man gives a skittish colt. The pews filled with faces hungry for interruption. Ranch hands in sun-bleached shirts with rope burns still bright across their knuckles. Storekeepers smelling of flour and turpentine. Two widows fanning themselves with hymnals. And the murmuring pressed like a swarm against the walls until the pastor's voice rose above it. "Dearly beloved," Amos began, and his words floated in the hot air like moths, brave but doomed. The wind crawled beneath the doorsill, the church boards creaked, and outside a colt nickered as if to say the sky would not crack for this. Emily felt the town like a set of reins on her shoulders. The hard stares, the knowing glances toward Margaret, the sympathy that stopped short of trouble. Her heartbeat threw itself against her ribs to be let out. Beside her, Margaret's hand hovered just close enough to be felt, a threat without contact, and her whisper brushed Emily's ear like a nettle. "Do not embarrass me." William stood without moving, and even at that distance Emily saw something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not impatience, but the stillness of a man standing in a doorway with the storm behind him, letting someone else decide whether to step through. Pastor Amos spoke the names, spoke the words he always spoke, words that had comforted the dying and married the hopeful, and he turned to the bride whose trials he knew only in rumor and asked the sentence that would pry a life open. "Do you, Emily Carter, take this man?" The church snapped taut like a rope under a sudden strain. Emily's fingers, slick with sweat, found the small paring knife she had tucked into the folds of her skirt, the humble steel that had peeled apples and scored bread and had felt like sanity in her palm all morning. And she stepped forward, the veil swaying, the air stunned. The paring knife flashed only an inch, enough to crack the pine tabletop when she drove it in up to the hilt. The sound, metal against soft wood, small but absolute, cut the murmurs clean. "I am not a ledger line," she said, and though her voice shook once at the start, it settled on a kind of flinty calm that made even the horse outside hush. "I am not a barrel of flour, not a stack of fence posts, not the note you signed when he was dying. I will not be traded like cattle to balance your books." She did not. Look at Margaret. She did not give the woman her eyes. She looked at the man in the black coat who would not move. Margaret's face went white, then hot, her lips flattening to a seam, the practiced, sweet-voiced authority breaking into a hiss. "You ungrateful—" she started, but Pastor Amos lifted a hand, more plea than command, and cut his gaze to William as if to ask whether the man intended to be a rock or a river. William Hayes set his hat gently on the edge of the altar table, close enough that Emily saw the hand-stitched band, the careful wear of years. He stepped forward one measured pace, his boots quiet on the runner, and when he spoke his voice carried that creak dusk steadiness, a thing that did not ask for anything it didn't first offer. "Miss Carter," he said, and the miss rolled through the heat like a cool thing, honor where none had been offered in months. "I did not come to claim you because coin changed hands. I came because it was asked of me, and because—" He swallowed once, a small muscle ticking along his jaw. "I believed I might keep your life from being ground smaller than it already has been." His gaze flicked to Margaret, and away without sticking. He did not fight the woman in public. That, too, was a kind of choice. I will not cage you for anyone's convenience. I do not want you to be my wife because of a debt. If you walk out of this church and never come to my gate, I will see you fed for a month, and I will ask nothing back. If you stay, it will be because you say so, and if you leave, it will be because you say so. It is a hot day for a hammer, he added softly, almost to himself, and I am done nailing shut other people's doors. The words landed like rain that doesn't yet cool the skin, but promises the smell of cooled earth. The pew-sitters shifted. The widows ceased their fanning. Margaret's whisper died in her throat, because it had not expected courtesy to be the weapon drawn. Pastor Amos's mouth parted. He had never heard a man throw his power to the floor so quietly. Emily's chest burned with an aching relief she did not trust. Her father, broad-shouldered, laughter like a bar chord, had taught her tenderness by example, and the year since he died had been a long subtraction. The world each week one thing lighter of goodness. She gripped the ribbon in her palm until it bit her skin and told herself the pain was real and therefore useful. She studied William as one might study a horizon to see whether it held shelter or simply distance. His face did not offer flattery or the blankness of men who refuse to be read. It offered time. "What happens?" Emily asked, surprising herself with the steadiness. "If I say no now?" Margaret made a sound like a kicked chair. William did not look away. "Then Pastor Whitlow will go home for his supper, and I will put my hat back on, and I will tell the men at my place that the creek fence must wait till tomorrow, and I will ride to the general store and settle whatever is owed by the Carter household this month, so that your stepmother does not sell the kettle to spite the kitchen. And then I will go home." The church was so quiet the dust motes could be heard arguing with the light. "And if I say yes?" Emily asked, her throat dry. "Then we will take a slow walk to the porch and sit for a moment where the air moves," he said, one corner of his mouth thinking about a smile and deciding against it. "And I will ask if you like your coffee the way most people in Dry Creek are pretending they do. And you can tell me the truth even if the truth is unkind. After that, we will see." It felt to Emily like the moment when a skittish horse decides whether the rope means whip or water. The chapel walls, the pews polished by 3 generations of restless hands, Margaret's brittle perfume, the old lace biting her shoulders, it all pressed toward her. But someone, the man people called hard, had pushed back the pressure, just enough to make room for her lungs. She pulled the knife free from the pine with a twist and a squeal. A scar remained in the wood, the way a choice leaves a mark on a life. Not ugly, simply proof. She set the blade on the table, not as surrender, but as an answer the room could understand, and lifted her chin. "I will not be bartered," she said again, softer now, but not smaller. "If I come on my feet." William bowed as if presented to a queen whose court was currently a church with a broken runner. "On your feet," he said. Pastor Amos, who had been praying without moving his lips, found his voice again and discovered that the words in his book tasted different in the mouth when freedom had been spoken aloud. He turned the page, and what had begun as a hammering became, if not a lullaby, then something made by human hands to hold rather than to close. Outside, the wind shifted, and a cloud's edge bit a strip from the sun. The church exhaled. Emily did not reach for William's arm. She did not reach for Margaret's approval. She stepped forward on her own feet and let the moment stand exactly as tall as it was. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across the plains like a kingdom built of cedar, stone, and stubbornness, and to Emily it felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The main house was a two-story structure of gray stone with cedar beams darkened by weather, its wide porch creaking under every step, its shutters rattling whenever the prairie winds dragged across the fields. By day, the air shimmered with heat and grasshoppers skittered like sparks across the parched ground. By night, coyotes sang from the hills, their howls threading the silence that lived inside the walls. Emily Carter, 19, carried herself through those halls like an intruder, her skirts whispering against the floorboards, her hand always trailing close to her own door latch. From the first evening, she turned the key in her bedroom lock and refused to let it go. Inside, she slept in a corner cot with her father's ribbon folded beneath her pillow, her trunk unopened, the smell of cedar and dust filling her lungs until she thought she might choke. She spoke to William only when she had no choice, and her words were clipped like a knife pressed too hard against parchment. William Hayes, now her husband in name, did not pound on her door or demand her obedience. Instead, he kept to his habits as if marriage had been a new fence post driven in beside the old ones, an addition, not a conquest. Each morning before sunrise, he saddled his horse, his tall frame stooping slightly as he swung the heavy saddle into place, his jaw shadowed with the dark stubble of a man too busy to shave before the light. He would ride out across the pasture with Duke trotting at his side, a German shepherd nearly 3 years old, with a thick coat of sable black and tan, ears always pricked, eyes the sharp amber of lantern glass. Duke had the frame of strength already grown, but the gait of a dog not yet weary, his muscles taut, his steps purposeful, his nose to the wind as though searching for threats that might never come. To William, Duke was more than a guard dog. He was the one creature that knew his silences without judgment. Emily heard the two of them leave before dawn, the muted thud of boots, the scrape of tack. Duke's low bark cut short as William hushed him. By the time she rose, the house would already smell faintly of coffee, and there, just outside her locked door, lay a book. The first morning it was Jane Eyre, its cover worn, the pages softened by another's reading. Emily nudged it aside with her toe and did not open it. The second day it was The Awakening, a newer copy with sharp corners. She left it untouched. On the third day came Little Women, the title scrawled in faded gilt, a slip of paper tucked between the pages but unread. Emily kicked it under her bed and muttered bitterly that she was not some child to be tamed with stories. The evenings were harder. Supper was served in silence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hartley, a stout woman with gray curls pinned at the back of her head, bustled in and out with stew pots and cornbread, but she never lingered. She was in her 50s, with kind brown eyes that seemed to flicker pity when they caught Emily's, but she did not speak out of turn. Years of service had taught her that words were arrows and silence was armor. She simply filled the bowls, wiped her hands on her apron, and left the two of them at the long cedar table. William ate with measured calm, his broad hands moving with quiet purpose, never reaching across to serve Emily, but always leaving the choicest cut nearer her plate. Emily often pushed her food away half-eaten, her eyes fixed on the window where the prairie grasses bent under the evening wind. On the first night she lost control. Her anger, compressed into silence all day, broke out in the slam of a vase against the hearth. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot, shards scattering across the rug. William only looked up once, his dark eyes unreadable, and then returned to his stew. He said nothing. That quiet infuriated her more than a shout would have, and she stormed up the stairs, her skirts snapping behind her. She slammed the bedroom door so hard that dust fell from the rafters. Still, he did not come. Days passed like this, each one feeding her frustration but starving her of reasons to hate him. At night, when the moon hung thin and pale above the house, Emily sometimes wandered barefoot into the hallway, careful not to let the boards creak. One evening, she drifted toward the glow of the parlor. There, William sat before the hearth, a weathered guitar resting in his lap. The flames painted his face softer than daylight ever allowed, shadows slipping across his cheekbones, catching on the scar at his jaw. His large hands, roughened by reins and rope, coaxed out a melody so low and mournful it sounded like the prairie itself had learned to sing. Emily froze in the doorway, her hand pressed against the wall. Duke lay curled at William's boots, his head resting on his paws, ears flicking to the rhythm of the strings. The dog's tail thumped softly whenever William shifted, as if in answer to an unspoken promise. The song was not joyous, nor was it despair. It carried something older, something cracked but still alive. A man's regret, perhaps, or the memory of a voice he could not hear anymore. Emily's throat tightened, and before he could sense her, she retreated, her steps silent, her heart quickening. Back in her room, she leaned against the door and pressed her palms over her face. She had not known William Hayes could play music. She had not known that men built like stone could hold something fragile in their hands without breaking it. That night, she opened the book beneath her bed. She read 10 pages before sleep claimed her. The days that followed were no less silent, but something had shifted. She still locked her door, still hurled sharp words when spoken to, still kept her father's ribbon clenched in her pocket. Yet at dawn, she paused before kicking the next book aside. At supper, she lingered half a moment before rising from the table. And when the prairie wind rattled her window at midnight, she listened for the soft strum of strings and the low sigh of a dog breathing near the hearth. For Emily Carter, the fortress of the Hayes Ranch remained a prison of stone and cedar. But in its heart, she had glimpsed something she could not yet name, something quieter than rage and stronger than fear. It unsettled her more than chains ever could, and though she did not yet admit it, she had begun to listen. The morning broke gray and uncertain, the kind of sky that could not decide whether to pour rain or let the sun scorch the earth again. The wind rolled over the prairie in low sighs, carrying with it the smell of sage and dust, bending the long grass like waves on a restless sea. The Hayes Ranch still slept, its barns crouched low against the horizon, the chickens scratching lazily in the dirt yard. Emily Carter stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her hair unpinned and falling in waves of chestnut across her face. She had slept little the night before, her mind tangled with the sound of William's guitar and the image of Duke's amber eyes flickering in the firelight. When William appeared, leading 2 saddled horses, his tall frame cast a shadow longer than the porch. He wore a simple shirt rolled at the sleeves, his forearms marked with rope scars and old burns, his jaw rough with morning stubble. Duke trotted at his heel, tail swishing, his coat gleaming where the early light caught it. William said nothing at first, only gestured with a slight nod toward the smaller horse, a bay mare with a gentler eye, chosen for Emily. She hesitated, but something in his quiet patience pressed her forward, and she mounted without a word. They rode across the open land, hooves thudding against the dry earth, the silence between them filled with the sounds of meadowlarks and the occasional rustle of jackrabbits darting through the brush. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. It was not fear exactly, but the pulse of possibility, the awareness that every moment could split her life in two. She kept her chin lifted, her eyes scanning the horizon as if to prove she belonged in a saddle beside him. The land widened as they ascended a low ridge, the hills rolling away into a quilt of gold and brown. When they reached the crest, William reined in his horse and dismounted. He stood tall against the sky, brushing dust from his black hat before placing it back on his head. Emily followed his gaze. 2 roads stretched ahead, one bending left, winding back through the hills toward the ranch, the other veering right, a straight cut toward Dry Creek and the distant railway line. "This road," William said, pointing toward the left, "will take you home. Quiet, familiar, mine." His voice was steady, carrying no demand. He turned slightly and pointed to the right. "That one leads to Dry Creek. Ride hard, and you'll reach the station by sundown. From there you could go anywhere." Emily tightened her grip on the reins, the leather creaking in her hands. She studied his face, shadowed under the brim of his hat. He was not smiling, not pleading, not holding her there. He was a man offering her something she had never truly been given, an open door. Her throat tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," William said, his jaw flexing, "I meant what I said. I don't want you to stay because of debts or the town's eyes. I want you to stay because you choose it." He took a few steps away, turning his back to her, his shoulders squared as if braced for whatever pain might come. "I will not follow. Whichever way you will ride alone." The wind picked up, tugging at Emily's hair, making the grasses hiss like a warning. She stared at the open horizon, the road to Dry Creek calling with its wild promise, its freedom laid out like a map. For a moment, she felt her body lean toward it. But then she looked back at William Hayes, at the man who had never raised his voice to her, who had set books by her door instead of locks, who had waited in silence rather than pressed chains against her. And she saw Duke sitting patiently at his master's side, his ears pricked, eyes on her as though he too waited for her decision. Slowly, Emily tugged the reins and turned her horse toward the left path. William's head shifted just enough for their eyes to meet, but he said nothing. She did not speak either. The silence was enough, a thread drawn taut between them, fragile but real. They rode back toward the ranch, the distance between their saddles no longer feeling like a wall, but something softer, something waiting. By the time they returned, the sun hung higher, burning the haze into clarity. Emily dismounted stiffly, her legs aching from the ride, but her mind was far from tired. As she climbed the porch steps, she noticed a boy waiting in the shade. He was thin, no more than 12, with a mop of dusty blonde hair and freckled skin browned by the sun. His clothes hung loose on his wiry frame, patched at the knees, his bare feet calloused from years of running errands. His name was Caleb, one of the errand boys from town, known for darting between ranches with news or messages, earning pennies where he could. He fidgeted with a folded paper in his hand, his blue eyes darting nervously from William to Emily. "Ma'am," he stammered, shoving the note toward her. "Was told to bring this. Not from me, I swear it." Emily unfolded the letter, her fingers trembling before she even read the words. The ink was smudged, the script hurried but recognizable. Her sister's hand. Sarah Carter, 14, slim and bird-like, with the same chestnut hair but lighter eyes, soft hazel that always seemed to search for kindness. Sarah had been delicate since childhood, often pale from illness, her frame narrow, her wrists like twigs. Yet behind her fragile appearance lived a spirit that tried to smile, even when shadows pressed too close. Emily's eyes raced over the words. Belle, she's going to sell me. Margaret says a horse trader from El Paso will pay 2 barrels of whiskey and money if he takes me as wife. I am only 14. Please do something before it's too late. Her breath hitched, her vision swimming. The paper crumpled in her fist as the porch seemed to tilt beneath her. She heard Margaret's voice in the back of her skull, cold and practical. Debt doesn't pay itself. William stepped forward, his broad hand steadying her shoulder. What is it? He asked, his voice low but sharp with concern. Emily's lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. She looked up at him, her eyes wet and wild. Sarah, she whispered. She's going to give her away. For whiskey, for money. William's jaw tightened, a muscle flicking like a strike of flint. Duke gave a low growl at his side, as if he too sensed the danger, his hackles lifting, his amber eyes sharp. William's hand fell to Duke's head, calming him with a brief touch, though his own composure was harder to keep. Emily clutched the letter to her chest. I cannot let her live what we... Her voice broke. She's still a child. The wind rattled the porch boards, carrying away the silence. William said nothing at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the trail disappeared into Dry Creek. Then he lifted his eyes to Emily's, steady as stone but edged with fire. Then we will ride, he said. Dry Creek was never a forgiving town, and on that afternoon, it wore its hardness openly. The main street lay beneath a haze of heat, horses stamping in front of the saloon where the piano played off-key notes drowned by laughter and the clink of glasses. Dust swirled every time a wagon rattled past, catching in the throats of bystanders leaning against posts and porches. William Hayes rode at a steady pace down that street, his broad shoulders set like stone, his jaw clenched under a dark stubble. Beside him, Emily Carter kept her chin high though her heart raced. Her hair pulled back, but loose strands clung to her damp face from the long ride. And at William's boot heel trotted Duke, the German shepherd, his lean body taut with readiness, coat glinting under the sun, ears pricked forward as though he could already smell trouble. Emily's thoughts burned as hot as the air. Sarah was somewhere near, a fragile 14-year-old, too slight for the world she had been thrown into. She pictured her sister's pale face and hazel eyes, eyes that used to follow Emily around the house like a tether to safety. Sarah had never been strong of body, thin wrists, narrow shoulders, a frame that seemed always one illness away from collapse. But her spirit was tender, the kind that wanted to please, to laugh even in hardship. To imagine her in the hands of a horse trader was a thought that made Emily's stomach knot. The saloon doors flung open before they reached it. Margaret Reed Carter, Emily's stepmother, stood outside with a smile that was more of a sneer, her hazel eyes sharp as blades. Her blonde hair, swept neatly into a bun, gleamed in the sun, and her figure, slim and taut with self-righteousness, seemed untouched by the dust that coated everyone else. She wore a blue dress fitted to flatter, but her mouth was set in a hard line. At her side lounged the buyer, a horse trader from El Paso named Silas Boone. Silas was in his late 30s, a heavy-set man with a face pocked from old scars of chickenpox and teeth stained from tobacco that he chewed with slow arrogance. His dark hair was slicked back with oil, but the dust clung to it nonetheless. He wore a brown vest over a yellowing shirt, and his boots were cracked but polished at the toe. His eyes, small and mean, darted constantly as though looking for his next prophet. Silas had a way of puffing his chest when he spoke, but his hands, thick-fingered and scarred, betrayed the roughness of a man who saw life only in terms of trades and wagers. "Ah, the proud wife returns," Margaret called, her voice dripping false sweetness that the town knew too well. "And she's brought her new master." She gestured toward Silas with mocking grace. "I've made arrangements. Sarah will be well taken care of, better than any girl with no dowry deserves." Emily's fury burst from her chest before William could speak. She dismounted, boots striking the ground with finality, her gray-blue eyes flashing. "You will not touch her!" she shouted, her voice ringing against the clapboards of the street. "She is a child, not a sack of grain, not a barrel of whiskey to barter away." The crowd thickened. Men leaned on railings, women peeked out from behind shutters, children crouched wide-eyed at corners. Dry Creek always loved a spectacle, but what unfolded was more than gossip. It was justice laid bare. Silas Boone shifted his weight, spitting tobacco into the dust. "The woman exaggerates. The girl's near grown. She'll have a roof, meals, and coin for her family." His tone was dismissive, but his eyes slid toward Emily with a predator's patience. William swung down from his horse, his height casting shadow over Silas. He was a man used to silence, but when he spoke it was a voice that carried, low, gravelly, the kind that made men listen whether they wanted to or not. "She is not for sale," William said. His eyes, dark as creek water, locked on Silas's until the smaller man shifted uneasily. Margaret's mouth twisted. "Do not lecture me. I clothed those girls. I fed them after their father left this world. They are mine to decide for." Duke growled, the sound low and guttural, hackles bristling as he stepped forward, placing himself between Emily and Margaret. The crowd murmured at the sight, for even an animal seemed to recognize the cruelty in Margaret's claim. William's gaze turned to the stepmother. His words struck like hammer blows. "A child is not livestock. She is not your purse, and Emily is not your burden to trade. I married her, yes, but not for debt. I gave her choice." The crowd stirred, whispers spreading. "Choice," he said. "She chose." Margaret's face flamed red, her composure cracking. "Ungrateful girl," she hissed at Emily. "You forget who put clothes on your back." Emily stood taller, her voice steady. "What you gave, you used as chains. My father would have never sold Sarah, and you know it. I will not let you finish what his death began." The town went silent. Even the piano inside the saloon faltered to a stop. Silas Boone cursed under his breath, suddenly wary of the mood, and stepped back. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered, adjusting his vest and slipping into the saloon's shadow. Margaret stood alone, her rage visible in every tremor of her jaw. William stepped closer, his presence towering, his voice like a storm contained but ready to break. "Come near either of them again," he warned, "and you'll find no neighbor in this town willing to deal with you." The crowd's murmurs turned to nods, a shift visible in the line of men leaning against posts, in the quiet approval of women behind their curtains. Dry Creek had seen enough. Margaret spat into the dust, her face carved in fury, then turned sharply and stormed back into the saloon, her heels striking hard against the floorboards. Emily's knees weakened, the adrenaline crashing through her body. William reached out a hand, steady, open. For the first time since their marriage, she took it, gripping his rough palm with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Duke circled once, then sat beside them, tail thumping lightly, as though sealing the moment. Around them, Dry Creek saw not just a bride and a rancher, but something more. A man who had given a woman her voice back, and a woman who had dared to use it. The dust of Dry Creek still clung to Emily's dress when they rode home that evening, the sun bleeding its last colors across the prairie. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth, the kind of twilight that promised silence but carried the weight of everything unspoken. Sarah rode between them on William's spare horse, her thin frame nearly swallowed by the saddle. She was 14, slight as a reed, her chestnut hair tangled from the ride, her hazel eyes wide with exhaustion, but stubbornly dry of tears. Her cheeks were pale, skin almost translucent, freckles faint along her nose. Though fragile in body, her back was straight, a small act of defiance against the fate she had narrowly escaped. She had clung to Emily's waist the first mile out of town, then gradually steadied herself, her hands gripping the reins with surprising resolve. William rode at Sarah's other side, tall in the fading light, his broad shoulders dark against the horizon. His hat shadowed his face, but Emily caught glimpses of him, jaw tight, lips pressed, eyes scanning the land as though danger might still rise from the grasses. Duke loped beside the horses, his powerful legs carrying him in smooth strides, ears alert, tongue lolling as he kept pace without strain. Occasionally, he looked up at Emily or Sarah, as if to check they remained safe, his amber eyes reflecting the low sun. They reached the ranch as the first stars lit the sky. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, stepped from the doorway with a lamp in hand. Her round face softened with relief when she saw Sarah, her brown eyes glistening. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, pulling the girl into her arms for a brief motherly squeeze before ushering her inside. The smell of stew and bread wafted from the kitchen, and though Sarah ate little, she sat quietly at the table, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flames in the hearth. Later, after Sarah had been settled with a blanket in the guest room, Emily lingered by the porch. The night was clear, the moon thin, coyotes howling distantly. William stood nearby, leaning against the porch post, his hat removed, his dark hair ruffled by the wind. His beard caught the lamplight, showing streaks of gray, his face carved by years of storms and solitude. He looked not at her, but at the horizon. "I was married once," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Her name was Clara. 16 when they placed her in my house. I was 30. Emily turned, startled, but remained silent. William's eyes stayed fixed on the land. She never said no, but she never smiled either. I thought giving her food and land was enough. I never asked her what she wanted. One winter I came home to find her in the snow, laudanum bottle empty. She was wearing the scarf I gave her for Christmas." His voice cracked just once before he mastered it again. "I buried her myself, dug the grave with my own hands. No preacher, no neighbors, just silence." The confession hung heavy in the cool night. Emily's throat tightened. She saw him differently then, not just a rancher with power, but a man bent under the weight of choices and losses. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and drew out the handkerchief she carried from her mother, soft cotton with faded pink stitching. She stepped closer and placed it in his palm without words. He looked down, then up at her, and though nothing more was said, something old and broken between them began to mend. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Emily rose early, helped in the barn, her skirts pinned high as she shoveled hay and hauled water. Sarah, still thin, took smaller tasks, feeding chickens, mending tears in linens, but she moved with purpose, as though proving she could belong here. William watched without comment, but Duke followed them constantly, his presence like a sentinel. The ranch hands, grizzled men with tired eyes, nodded at Emily in passing, their skepticism slowly replaced by quiet approval. One of them, Tom Weaver, a weathered man with a limp from an old cattle stampede, even tipped his hat to her one morning. In the evenings, Emily read aloud by the fire, Sarah curled on the rug with Duke's head resting in her lap. William sat nearby, carving small wooden animals with the same knife he used for fence work. The silence was no longer hostile, it was chosen. But the bond came clearest one evening on the porch. The air smelled of sunburned earth, fireflies blinking lazily in the grass. Emily closed her book, her heart restless. "That day on the ridge," she said softly, "when you told me I could ride away. What would you have done if I had?" William's hands stilled on the blade. He did not look at her at first. "I would have let you go. And then I would have kept living, fed the stock, mended the fences, worked the land. But—" He turned, eyes steady now. "I would not have waited on the porch anymore." Emily's breath caught. "No one has ever waited for me," she whispered. "I would have," he said simply, "even from a distance." Something within her cracked open, not with fear, but with release. She looked down at her hands, calloused now, no longer soft, and then felt his. William reached across, his grip warm, rough, deliberate. It was not the grip of a man claiming possession. It was the grasp of a man holding the hand of a woman who chose to be there. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the swing creaking gently beneath them. Duke shifted at their feet, sighing into the quiet. The drought still gripped the land, debts still shadowed the town, but in that moment, there was something that felt like water. Emily lifted her face, her eyes searching William's. Her voice was steady. "I was angry," she said. "Angry that you bought me, even with good reasons. Angry that I felt safe when I didn't want to. But tonight, after all that's passed, I know who I want to stand beside, me." She reached up, touched his face and kissed him, soft, certain, free. When she pulled back, she held his gaze. "I choose you, not because I must, because I want to." The stars burned brighter above them, and for the first time since her father's death, Emily felt as if her life belonged to her again. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not thunder in the sky or fire from heaven. They are quiet, like a hand that chooses to stay, like a heart that finally says yes in freedom. Emily's story reminds us that God's love works through the people He places in our path, through patience, kindness, and the courage to give others a choice. And maybe that is the lesson for us in our own daily lives, that no matter how broken the past has been, God can take the pieces and shape them into something whole again. He can turn silence into peace, loneliness into family, and despair into hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs reminding that love is still alive. Leave us a comment below, tell us what part spoke to you, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story of faith, love, and redemption. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He guide your choices with freedom, and may His light shine on your family today and always.